it's wonderful to see the gallery here and a lot of friends that I recognize from other sessions. As I mentioned, we're so proud to have Frank Cespedes with us today. Frank was a professor of mine when I was at Harvard Business School working there. I took his program called Aligning Strategy and Sales. And that name should give you an idea of what Frank's focus is. It's sales is part of the strategy of an organization. It's part of marketing. And he's going to give us a great overview of his work. Quick note, as I mentioned, we're going to use the chat box for any questions. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll have time at the end of Frank's presentation to talk about that. So Frank, as Dan has said, has been at Harvard Business School for a number of years, and I think we're going to all learn something wonderful from him today. So let me pass it on to you so we don't waste any more time. We only have an hour together today. Frank, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, here. What I'm going to talk about with you this morning, and the format we've got is I'm going to spend 20-25 minutes talking about this book. Then Bill will moderate our session, but basically this is yet another book about sales. And I phrase it that way because if you go to Amazon and you click books and you put in sales, out will come over 80,000 items. As far as I can tell, the only management topic that generates more SKUs at Amazon is, quote, leadership. It generates about 90,000, but sales is a close second. Now, you all know the old aphorism, no single drop of rain ever feels responsible for the flood. Let me explain why I decided to add to that monsoon. And basically, I have two motivations. The first one is this. Sales is the most context-dependent part of business functions. Now, when I say what I'm about to say, you will say, of course, but I assure you, as someone who has more than a reasonable amount of experience working with companies around the world, sitting on boards, working with VCs, it is astonishing how often smart, educated people forget these basics. Selling varies depending upon what you're selling by product. Selling software is different than selling professional services, different than selling durables. Selling enterprise software is different than selling software as a service. It also differs depending upon where and to whom you're selling. Selling in North America is different than selling in India or the Middle East or Latin America. Yet, while sales is very context dependent, it is that topic in business where people feel most comfortable making these huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any data beyond n=1. Well, when I worked at Google, here's what we did, that sort of thing. So my first motivation is simply the motivation of someone who's looked at this topic both in practice and as an academic for 30 years. What does research tell us and not tell us about this core activity in business? The other motivation is I think it's a good time to write about this topic. There is no doubt that the data revolution, digital online technologies is making a big difference in buying and selling. But my reading of what people say about that, and I'm not just talking about, pop blogs, I'm talking about some of my colleagues. My reading of what they say is that they simply misunderstand the implications of these technologies. And the pandemic has raised the stakes for getting this right. It's raised the stakes for companies in terms of growth, and it's also raised the stakes for leaders and their resource allocations. Now, let me give you a quick example, all right? What I've got on this slide is what I think you would agree is among the more common current assertions about selling. That e-commerce means, if not the elimination, to use the current jargon, the so-called disintermediation of the salesperson, and the pandemic makes this, quote, a new normal, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I get an email about that almost daily. Now, here's the data. First, I hope we understand that the internet is not new. It's been around for over 3 decades as a commercial medium, and e-commerce has been part of the internet since it started. Books.com was selling online while Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, was still working on Wall Street. And after 30 years plus, essentially free from sales taxes, e-commerce as a percentage of total US retail sales in 2019, just before the pandemic, was 11.4%. Now, when I ask MBA students and executives, what do you think that number is? I typically get estimates from 30 to 60%. In other words, orders of magnitude that don't reflect reality. Now, what's happened during the pandemic? We just got the fourth quarter data. I want you to pay attention to Q2, second quarter of 2020, because it was during the second quarter in the United States and most other countries that there were maximum lockdown conditions. Now, clearly, when you've got stores that are closed or people are legitimately afraid that if they go into a store, they might catch a virus and die, clearly you're going to get more online buying and selling. But notice, even in Q2, it increased less than 5% versus 2019. And as you can see, it trended down in Q3 and further down in Q4. So again, this is the data. I want to be very blunt about this. I think that 99% of the so-called new normal predictions that you're hearing are silly. They are simplistic straight line extrapolations of lockdown condition data. If you want to really get up to speed on this, there's a British historian, Stephen Davies. He's published a wonderful monograph about this late last year, The History and Economics of Pandemics. And Davies, after surveying all this, I think reaches this conclusion, and I'm quoting, "A major pandemic does not introduce something truly novel." And he's got good reasons for suggesting that. It instead magnifies trends that were already underway. So if we look at what was happening online before the pandemic, what we see that as a marketing and selling medium, online media were cluttered, distrusted, and frankly, a classic example of the law of diminishing returns. Again, this is the data. Usage on the major social media platforms in the US was flat for 4 years, and in fact, had declined among people less than 35. You know, we read all of this stuff about millennials. This is the data about millennials. Diminishing returns. Facebook ads have increased 30% per year since 2016. But Facebook's ad prices have decreased since 2018, and they've continued to decrease during the pandemic. Now, why is that? It's not because Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want to make more money. It's because people are not getting the ROI. Low virality. I have a colleague at Harvard, Sunil Gupta. He's looked into this in detail. 90% of messages on social media do not diffuse at all. You know, there's this perception, which I think is true, that what social media does is create this sort of echo chamber. In other words, people talking to people that agree with them, increases polarization, etc. There's probably some truth to that, but 90% of these people are simply talking to themselves. I mean, that's it, right? And then what we, I think, have seen for various reasons is increased awareness of cybersecurity issues, Zoom bombing, regulatory actions. Now, why does this matter? Why does it matter that we get this straight? I think it matters because it affects core activities of leaders. And I don't care what business you're in. This is part of what you get paid for, and you can't run away from it. If you don't separate fact from hype, then a couple of bad things will inevitably happen. You will make bad or suboptimal decisions about priorities. What's an asset? You can initiate a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I think we have seen this in certain industries in the last decade. You basically get better and better at activities like social media that customers value less and less. You can worry all you want about disruption, but you need a relevant go-to-market model in order to do something besides worry about it. And then in any competitive market, you eventually are a victim to those who can separate fact from hype. All right? Now, what is changing and why? Let me get to the book, and then I'll turn things back over to Bill. The most important thing about selling is buying, not the salesperson. Most important thing about selling is who buys, why, and how. And that is changing significantly. I'm going to get academic with you for a moment, but stick with it. For over a half century, buying and therefore sales models have been framed in terms of what academics call a hierarchy of effects model. In other words, what the job of the salesperson is to move the prospect from awareness to interest to desire to action. AIDA, AIDA, as in the Verdi opera. That's been the basis of most sales models, virtually every CRM package that's out there. And that's why 98% of what you read about sales is about so-called funnels and pipelines. But that's not the way people in the third decade of the 21st century are buying in most markets. They're now online and offline at multiple times throughout their buying journeys. It's an omni-channel buying world. And that makes a big difference. That changes significantly sales tasks and what's required to manage this effectively. For one thing, it places more emphasis on the value added of the salesperson when they do interact with customers. Salespeople are not going away. The number of salespeople in the United States, I hope we can agree the United States is a reasonably advanced industrial economy. The number of salespeople in the United States has increased steadily in the 21st century. But their interactions with customers have changed. The days of the rep being a walking, talking version of direct mail are over because the buyer already, through their search, has made product comparisons, price, etc. This kind of buying means that sales becomes more of a cross-functional activity. Why is that? Well, it's a little bit like if you remember the old movie about Ghostbusters, who are you going to call? When the buyer has an issue, who are they going to call? They're going to call the person who sold them the product or service, and de facto, that salesperson then has to go back into their companies and manage across the functions. And that's not easy in most companies. If you want, we can talk about this other data about why companies are increasingly siloed. This is a big issue. Sales is undergoing a data revolution, and this is something that will continue throughout our lifetimes. And it has multiple impacts. Let me give you one. All right, let me just talk about one that I see on boards I sit on, companies I work with. Because of the data revolution, sales is more transparent in more companies, and finance gets that data. And finance people are annoying. Once they get data, they start to ask questions. the first thing they do is go, holy mackerel, you know, I had no idea how much money we were spending on a fully burdened basis on sales. Then they begin to ask the sales leaders questions. And the reality, if we're honest, is that most sales leaders are not going to win awards for financial literacy and financial sophistication. Most of them can tell you something about the top line on a financial return, but not anything really about cost to serve or return on capital. And the requirements for financial literacy there are growing dramatically. And then finally, just as a general rule about companies around the world, and McKinsey has actually done good research about this, but what we see going on, and again, this will continue for a generation, is a shift in productivity efforts from the back end to the front end of the value chain. Companies actually have done a good job with shared services and supply chain management. Their cost of goods sold have decreased in the last 15 years, but their SG&A, and especially the S part, the selling part, has increased as a percentage of costs. So why are productivity efforts shifting? You know, for the same reason, you know, the old story about the bank robber. When the bank robber is asked, why do you rob banks? He says, well, that's where the money is, isn't it? Well, this is increasingly where the costs are. Now, very briefly, some of the implications for core areas in your firms, all right? The first one is about people. This affects hiring criteria, training, and so forth. And I just want to point out a few things. There are challenges in sales hiring that are relatively unique, that do not exist in many other functions. For example, if you're looking to hire an engineer, you can go to a school and it's a little bit like walking into a buffet. What are you interested in? Electrical engineering, chemical engineering, etc. If you're looking for someone in finance or accounting, you can find people that majored in those subjects. Same is true with computer programming. But of the nearly 5,000 colleges and universities in America, less than 200 even have a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is an activity where people start out knowing virtually nothing about what they're supposed to do. And that gets us to the other element here. Companies already spend a ton of money on this. The reality, and I urge you to talk to your finance people, the reality, if you look at sales hiring and training and aggregate those numbers, the number you're going to come up with is probably as big as some of your biggest CapEx, capital expenditure decisions. But it rarely gets the same rigorous attention that buying software gets. Companies already spend 20% more per capita on sales training than they do on any other function. But the ROI there is infamously disappointing for systematic reasons that we might discuss. Process. As I explained a moment ago, many sales models are simply based on obsolete assumptions about buying. And both analytics, the data revolution, but also the pandemic, I think is beginning to reveal this. Let me give you an example. One thing I think the pandemic has demonstrated to many companies is that in effect, they were overpaying for many tasks in their sales models. They were using expensive people to do things like lead generation or demos or some types of meetings that can be done by less expensive people or can be done online demos or in some cases can be done by an algorithm. And I don't think that learning is going to go away after the pandemic. And this also, I think, affects companies' needs to rethink how they organize sales. And again, I want to give you one example of this. The data I'm about to cite varies by industry and company. But in the aggregate, if you look at how much time salespeople actually spend in customer interactions, and by customer interactions, I don't simply mean showing up and making a pitch. I mean interactions in person, online, via email, via the web, all of that. On average, salespeople spend about 30% of their time in customer interactions. Now think about the impact in your business if you can make that 35%, 40%. In most businesses, that is a huge gain. Among other things, as well as increasing productivity, it suddenly makes available to you segments that were uneconomic, but now become economically viable. In other words, it increases your total addressable market. That's a big deal. Partners, an omni-channel buying world requires multi-channel marketing. And, it's still amazing to me. I sit in some board meetings and strategy meetings where, basically leaders are engaging in what I think are these sort of sterile Oxford University type debates. Should we be online? Should we be offline? It's the third decade of the 21st century. The answer is yes, right? But notice what happens when you go to market this way. Salespeople, what they have to do changes. And this is, again, a big deal. Among other things, the individual contributor, which is what the vast majority of salespeople are, now also, when they have channel partners, need to manage. And that's one of the infamously difficult transitions in this area of human resources. Pricing, there are now many more tools available for price testing. But there's surprisingly high inertia at firms about this. And then finally, productivity. And here I'll just say a word. There's a Harvard Business Review article that literally just came out this week by me that goes into this in more depth. But most of you on this call are working in services-dominated economies. That's one reason why the pandemic has been such an economic catastrophe in most nations. The United States is a good example. 75% of our GDP is in services businesses. That's where the pandemic has made its biggest impact. Now, sales productivity is a service and a key driver of economic growth in economies like that. And one of the implications, and if you work in a firm where your CEO makes these grand speeches at Davos about stakeholders, I urge you to somehow find a polite way to bring this up in a meeting. In economies and companies like that, increasing sales productivity is not simply something you do in order to maximize profits, although I don't think any CEO needs to apologize for that. It is also a big social responsibility of business. It not only affects the careers of millions of people, it affects growth. And we know this. There's good research about this. Just look at our last two elections in the United States. Economic growth affects other things in society, democratic values, the way people relate to each other, speech, of the possibility of addressing inequalities, etc. So again, this is not something you need to apologize for. It's not just about shareholders. It is very much about society as well. Now, let me end my aria there. And Bill, I'll turn things back over to you for any questions and so forth. And I'm going to stop sharing while I do that, so potentially I can see people.
Great. Thanks, Frank. That was great. I really appreciate it. Having read the book, I was curious to see which of the 5 Ps, which of the 5 areas you would stress the most. I mean, we certainly talked a lot about people, the process, the partners, the pricing, and the productivity are all equally important. And I think the last few moments of your talk really made that come true. The first question I've gotten though on the from the group is an interesting one. Is how important is financial literacy to sales? And this is from someone called Nithin. I hope it's not our friend Nithin Nouri, but
Well, I hope it is actually. But I think it's very important, and it's very important. Let me begin with a narrower perspective and then blow it up. First of all, as I said earlier, it's important if you're going to pursue a career in this line of work, right? Look, throughout my career, the single biggest complaint I have heard from the C-suite about their colleague in sales, the sales VP is, Charlie or Charlotte, great person, but we made that person head of sales, and they're a great salesperson, but they can't manage their way out of a paper bag, and they don't really understand the way enterprise value is created or destroyed in our business. Now the data makes that more than a complaint that one can live with. So it's important for careers. But secondly, it is, again, I want to get back to the service economy and the central importance of sales in any for-profit business. If you think you can run a business without having a good customer acquisition and customer retention model, good luck. But my advice to my students when they come across a bad customer acquisition or retention model is to sell short. This is fundamental. And let me give you a specific example, all right? Because I see this play out again and again. You have a strategy meeting. Now let's assume it's the strategy meeting from heaven, right? Let's assume that we really come up with a coherent strategy as opposed to what a lot of companies do, which is, hey, let's pick a big number and go for it. Let's assume we've got a coherent strategy. And now the issue is we need to implement it. And in most companies, a sales force is a primary driver of how you execute strategy. Now, here's the data. And this data has been remarkably consistent throughout my career. It'll vary maybe 3 to 5% annually. If you look at sales incentive plans in companies around the world, and you look at the incentive component, in other words, how is the salesperson going to maximize their compensation? In 70% of those plans, the answer is volume. End of chapter, end of paragraph, all right? Now, notice what the implication is, what the message is to the salesperson. In a plan like that, there is no such thing as a bad customer. There simply isn't, because it's simply about volume, irrespective of profitability of customer acquisition cost, cost to serve, etc. Now let's get back to the strategy meeting. The core element of any business strategy is what in business schools we call scope. Scope is the jargon that's used for decisions about where companies play and don't play in their market. When you've got a sales comp plan like that, it really does not matter what the CEO and her colleagues think the strategy is. I can tell you what is going on in the field, and it has nothing to do with that strategy. So you bet financial literacy is very, very important.
So kind of a follow-up to that question, H.S. Mishra has, I'll try and summarize his question. He talks about we're now in a VUCA world. We're certainly in an uncertain situation. How much does a salesman need to know? There's so many things that could be on the plate for him. When you're hiring someone to be a salesman, do they need to leap tall buildings in a single bound, if you like?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of good questions embedded in that excellent question. Let me begin with the first part of the question, and then let's say a bit more about hiring, all right? What does a salesperson need to know? A salesperson needs to know everything about their customers and prospects. That's what they get paid for. salesperson needs to know who buys, why, and how. That's the core in that activity. And that's presumably what a lot of your training and development and metrics are intended to institute. Now, the other part of this question, I think, is a broader and very important managerial question about hiring. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are inherent challenges in hiring salespeople because, there are very few educational priors. But while sales hiring is tough, common practices in most companies make it even tougher. All right. You know that old saying, it's attributed to a number of people. Life is tough, but it's even tougher when you're stupid. This is an area of business where there's a classic example of this. Couple of common practices that may characterize your companies. The first is a significant over-reliance on interviews. Now, the data I am about to cite to you has been supported by over 60 years consistently of good research. And I want to emphasize consistently. What I'm about to cite to you is as close to an established fact as anything you will ever hear from a management professor. The correlation between the evaluations that people get in their interviews, and this, by the way, is in every function, but it's especially true in service jobs like sales, the correlation that they get in their interviews and their actual on-the-job performance varies from about 0.1 to 0.4. But even in the best of circumstances, it's less than the 50-50 odds of flipping a coin. And in fact, and I am not making this up, all right? When I tell this to executives in our programs, it's a little bit like the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. First they deny it, then they get angry, then, what the psychologists call exceptionalism. Well, that's true for you, but I know how to peer into people's souls. It's not true. The correlations actually indicate that especially in services, businesses, you literally would have been better off not interviewing, all right? Now, I do have colleagues who, in the face of this irreproachable data, do tell companies not to interview. My own feeling is that only someone who's never managed a business can say that seriously. Of course you interview, right? I mean, people manage people, especially in sales. People have to work with people, but you've got to augment these common hiring practices with a lot of other practices that are talked about in the book that do make a difference. For one thing, sales is about behavior. It is the ultimate performance art in business. It's not simply about attitude. It is not about how well this person shined in their interview. One of the things I do in my MBA course at Harvard Business School, at least before the pandemic, we have this hiring exercise in my course. The MBAs are given the LinkedIn profiles, literally of the human beings they're going to interview. I bring in salespeople from the Boston area. They sit down. The MBAs are asked, what are you going to ask and why? It's basically to hire for these two jobs we've discussed in previous case studies. And then we debrief. And when we debrief, now look, you can make fun of Harvard MBAs if you want, but IQ is not their scarce resource. When we debrief, two things always come out. The first thing is I ask the MBAs, what do you think? And they say, wow, people who sell for a living are pretty good at interviews. Who knew, right? Who knew? And then the second thing, and this is what I find characterizes practice as well. When you look at what they said in preparation for the exercise, in other words, what are you going to look for? What's at the top of their lists are these sort of charismatic qualities, sense of urgency, commitment, etc. Stuff that's very difficult to figure out in an interview that you only can see in behavior. And what's at the bottom of their list are things you can figure out in an interview. Communication skills. Is he or she a mumbler or not? And, again, these things seem clear, but they characterize a lot of hiring processes in this area, and they make an inherently tough job tougher.
So Frank, I think you've answered Shilpi Singh's question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What's the most effective training method for these people that you've hired? How do you get them to follow the strategy of the company?
Yeah. Now, first, let me tell you what isn't. And if Nitin, our former dean, is on the call, I'd ask him to cover his ears. But again, the data about this is pretty clear. Classroom training in sales is not that effective. The research here indicates that salespeople forget about 80+% of what they learn in a training seminar within 90 days. I mean, that's a great example of quarterly short-termism, all right? Sales is a classic example of what's important in adult learning. And I'll make one other comment. Adults learn by doing, all right? They're not studying for an exam. They're not taking SATs. They learn by doing. It is task-oriented learning. And in sales in particular, salespeople are a perfect example of what the learning theorists call modeling behavior. This is why, by the way, getting back to the previous question, this is why talent and hiring are so important, because it has cumulative effects. The way salespeople learn, the way they get better, is by watching the best of their peers engage in tasks. Okay, that was clever the way you answered that objection. Oh, that's how you upsell to the premium package, etc. Now, what does this mean for training and development? This is one of the areas where technology is or should be your friend, all right? There are now technologies that allow for just-in-time learning and the getting of information to salespeople when they will actually use it and where. Now, when and where will they use it? On their way to make a sales call, and in many cases during the actual sales conversation. These technologies are out there now in increasing abundance. They come down in price. And again, if you're not using them, shame on you. Now, let me give you a tip about how to use them. Here, you got to get back to what I said about buying. If you don't understand who buys, why, and how, you're not going to be able to use these technologies optimally. But those would be the two headlines, Bill, that I would offer to leader excellence participants about where they're already, in most of your companies, already spending a lot of money.
Well, Harvard's invested a lot in just-in-time learning, and Leaders Excellence does a good bit of that too. So it's good to hear that the just-in-time learning is important. Move on to a question from James Wan, which kind of is interesting. In a small company, what happens when one of your really good salesmen becomes so invaluable that he becomes almost in control of the whole sales cycle?
Yeah, they own the customer, as we say. I teach a case. It's my favorite case to teach. That is exactly about this. And let me say a little bit about the way that discussion goes. First, the executives, they clearly see what is going on, that this fellow, in effect, owns those relationships and is not necessarily managing them in a way that maximizes our enterprise value. And a lot of them say, well, let's take his accounts away. And I always say the same thing. Is this what you say to your salespeople? Do you really think the answer to this question is to say to our salespeople, don't establish relationships, all right? No, that's obviously part of what we want them to do. The root causes of that are typically not in that person, all right? The root causes of that are in your sales model. read the chapters in the book about sales models. That's what you've got to think through in order to deal with that. But I don't think the managerial answer to that issue is to say to the rep, shame on you. You shouldn't be establishing good relationships with customers. That's the road to hell is paved with actions like that.
Like that leads us to another question that's coming in from Germain Saint-Denis, who's one of our loyal members. He talks about a course at IBM, which he took some time ago, had an emphasis on customers' buying cycle and the general ideas that were presented here. Is the buying cycle still something that is that we have to be aware of? And to add to that, a question that came in from another person: what are the skills that salespeople have to develop if they want to get closer to the C-suite? And can they get closer to the C-suite?
Yeah. Let me start with the second question. Again, I want to get back to the basics here. I said what I said about sales as context dependent is not only true, but on reflection, I think, obvious, but often forgotten. Look, the answer to the C-suite question is, it depends, right? It's very different because it is context dependent. Let me just say, though, two things that I think are supported by research. One is access is getting more and more difficult to the C-suite for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the proliferation of media. The second thing is watch what you wish for, all right? Before you get your salespeople access to the C-suite, make sure they know what the heck they're doing when they get there. That is a fundamentally different conversation. The whole purpose of most other managers in a company is to act as gatekeepers to the C-suite, to vet the rep, the product, the service, etc. All of that's done. By the time you get to the C-suite, among other things, to get back to one of our topics, what are C-suite executives concerned about if they're doing their job? They're concerned about profitable growth. Those elements of financial literacy and business outcomes become more important. And again, a lot of reps are comfortable and frankly good farther down. So again, watch what you wish for there. Now, Bill, you got to remind me, what was the other part of the question beyond the C-suite part?
I think the other part was, so what are the key skills that a mid-career executive needs if she or he is trying to get to the C-suite? And is there a chief sales officer that that they should be aspiring to?
Well, but let's move this. I mean, in answer to chief sales officer, I will give you the same advice I give to my MBA students. They take my course, and this happens every year. About a dozen of them will come up to me afterwards and say, wow, I had no idea that sales could be that intellectually interesting. And I show them the data, if I can be perfectly blunt. Another thing that technology is doing is increasing the power of sales in most companies and decreasing the power of marketing. So they all say that, wow, when I graduate, I'm going to work in sales. And this is my advice to them, my advice to the person who asked that question. Sales is an area, I'll use tech companies. I think they're a good example. Sales is an area where in certain tech companies, it's part of the DNA, the fabric, right? But in other tech companies, it's all about product. And what I'm about to say is not an exaggeration. The sales leader is literally invited out of the room when the C-suite starts to talk about business and strategy, because we don't want the children to know a lot about our cost structure, that sort of thing. This is very, again, context specific, tends to come straight down from the top. So my advice there is pick your company and know your culture, because it varies tremendously around this area. Then let me look at the other side, because I'm assuming that many of you are not in the sales function. And again, that Harvard Business Review article I talked about goes into this in a bit more depth. If you're a CIO, if you're a CFO, You don't need to know how to manage a sales force. That's not your day job. But you do need to know the questions to ask about your company's sales model. And the reality, and again, you'll see the data in the article, the reality is that increasingly the C-suite is siloed among functional specialists. Fewer people than ever before have made it to the C-suite, not only without any sustained experience in marketing or sales, but many of them without P&L, profit and loss responsibilities. Ironically, the C-suite in many companies around the world look more like universities than they do like profit maximizing machines. But that remains a core responsibility, in my view, of any senior leader. You better know the right questions to ask there, and many do not.
Well, we're getting to the very end of our hour, but I have one last question to end on a positive note. What can a CEO or a manager do to retain the best salespeople? What, besides paying them more, of course, we all know that.
I was about to say, there's a high correlation between compensation and retention. I think, again, people are different. A lot of salespeople go into that job because they prize their autonomy. And in fact, the worst thing you can do with people like that is to make them managers. They're not good at it. They don't like it. It alienates them. All right. Then there are others that do want that career path. I don't think there's one simple answer to that. But let me get back to what I said about the social impact here. Look, if you're, and again, the pandemic is making this a big issue. In any company, there are very few alternatives to growth. Growth in any company correlates very, very closely with the opportunities that people have, not only in sales, but in any function. And the single best way to retain people in any function is to provide more and more of those opportunities. So again, I hope the stock markets are right about, they obviously are assuming some kind of V-shaped recovery. I got to tell you, that's not what I see, but that I think is the single best thing you can do. Bill, can I get back to these slides for just a second?
I was just going to suggest that you do that. We've been learning about how sales management works, how it can work, and now I'd like to hear more about the book that tells us sales management.
All right, well, can you see the slide I have in front?
Not right this minute, no.
Yeah, I think once again, I somehow messed up on, on the slide.
This is so reassuring to those of us who work with Zoom and are constantly frustrated by
Yeah,
it.
but I've got, after about 200 Zoom sessions in the last year, I have no excuse. Forget the slides. I want to say two things. One is, look, this is about sales. You can get the book on Amazon, Harvard Business Review Press. You should buy thousands of copies each. It'll make a great gift for your kids. The second thing I want to do is simply thank each and every one of you for the time you've invested in this session. I want to wish you the best in your life and careers. And I'll depart with what we now tend to say at HBS, stay positive, test negative. Dan, Bill, I'll turn things back over to you.
And I'm going to turn it back to Dan, who will wrap things up on behalf of Leaders Excellence.